a range of issues associated with estate decarbonisation. I will give a short introduction, which is going to be a very short one, actually, as most of you have attended previous sessions, and then we will move on to look at the at today's topic. So this is number 5 webinar of the series, organized by the Office of Government Property and presented by Modern Energy Partners. This is the 4th one out of 5, and it will be focusing on energy monitoring. Previous sessions focused on planning and how to get funded, the details of setting up a program, how decarbonisation can be combined with end-of-life asset management, and the final one, which is on Friday, will be about program delivery. Overall, it has been, my view is that it has been great to be able to consider so many aspects of planning and implementing a decarbonisation program. The opportunities need to be identified and quantified from an early stage in order to be able to deal with the different challenges in later stages. And most of these challenges are associated with implementation and monitoring issues. The MEP team has worked with several departments, government departments in recent years. They have been actively involved in every step of the process and can definitely provide us with this holistic view of the challenge and the steps to deal with it. For this reason, we at the Office of Government Property are very fortunate and very happy to work with the MEP team in order to increase the sustainability capability across the property function. This is, as a way of introduction, just a few more things to note. The usual things, if you have attended previous workshops, webinars. First of all, the presentation is being recorded, so you can watch it later if you want. There is another webinar on Friday. As I said, if you want to sign up for that one, please do. If you don't know how to do it, just get in touch with us. And finally, you will be sent an evaluation and feedback form after the end of this webinar. Please complete it and return it to us. So far, we have received very good feedback, so it seems like you have enjoyed the webinars. I hope you enjoy the session today as well. And that's it for me. Time to hand over to the MEP team. Richard, Chris, Carl, over to you.
Thank you, Christos. So yeah, as Christos says, today's session is about planning for decarbonisation and specifically setting up a monitoring framework. So briefly, we'll cover an overview of the MEP programme, taking a deep dive into what we've been doing in the telemetry and data workstream, giving a high-level overview of why we need to monitor energy consumption and what best practice looks like across the sites. I'm more than happy to take questions throughout as we go along, but there's also a Q&A session at the end as well. If you want to say questions, either raise your hands or put the questions in the chat. So I'm Carl Holland. I'm the Technical Collaboration Manager in the modelling team at the Energy Systems Casport. One of my roles before joining the Energy Systems Casport was in energy management at a public sector organisation, and I had responsibility for 300 sub-meters across 30 buildings and with an annual energy bill of sort of nearly £3 million. So I'm the technical lead on this telemetry and data workstream, and I'll let Richard introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. It's Richard Leach. I've been involved, also work at the Energy Systems Catapult, and with the MEP programme, I've predominantly been involved in the concept design aspect of the programme. So that is developing a design for a site to decarbonise and move on to net zero. So a key part of that has been really thinking about how we can do that in a consistent, structured, but also a whole system way, which the Energy Systems Catapult is a key part of that, is trying to think of the whole energy system when we decarbonise rather than just as particular aspects of the energy system. Yeah, so I suppose some of the learning from that. So going into the programme, we've worked with lots of different organisations, different consultancies, where historically, energy managers or consultants or professionals think of how you achieve net zero in their own way. There is no consistent guide of how you should go about that, how you baseline the sites, how you techno-economic evaluation of the whole energy system. There are things like Salix, heat networks, but we've been trying to bring that all together. So there's a consistent approach of thinking how to decarbonize government estate sites, and that's been my focus. Thanks, Carl.
Yeah, so as Christos mentioned, this is the fourth in the series of 5 webinars. Obviously, we're talking about monitoring framework today, and the final session is on Friday at 11. Hand over to you, Rich, for the overview of MEP.
Okay, thanks, Carl. So yeah, the Modern Energy Partners Programme, it's been a programme funded by BEIS, working with the Energy Systems Catapult in partnership with the Cabinet Office, and the 3 main departments we've worked with are the MOJ, MOD, and a number of NHS trusts. It's a key part about it is to think about the things I've talked about just earlier, about how can you what's a consistent way to think about the whole energy system and decarbonize the site. So when the program was set up, there was a target. Things have changed during the duration of the program, where it's firmly, the agenda has moved on to net zero. And yeah, a lot of the learning is really, all of the different departments and different parts of government is trying to understand how they do things and evaluate things, so we can try and develop that approach. Next slide, please, Carl. So the programme is focused on campus-style organisations, so hospital MOD bases and MOJ sites. As I said, when the programme was set out, there was a 50% target of non-traded emissions. So the non-traded aspect is really fossil fuel used on site, so predominantly around heat. So thinking there is within government is that electricity is decarbonising, and there is policy and action around decarbonising the grid, but there hasn't been a sort of consistent focus on how we decarbonise the more challenging aspects of heat and sometimes transport. So the programme has looked at how do we decarbonise predominantly heat by 50%, at looking at all aspects of the site. So where we've decarbonised heat aspects by 50%, total emissions for a site, when you include electricity as well, decarbonisation, as we've generally achieved, anywhere up to sort of near net zero at sites. It's thinking about a new approach of considering the whole system and all of the different aspects together. So thinking about the link between things like building fabric and heat system design, thinking about the electrical strategy for a site that's related to the heat strategy. So we've considered aspects like electric vehicle charging and projected demand for electric vehicles. So some of the sites we've worked with have got a lot of car parking, public car parking, staff car parking on site, fleet transport, so potential electrification. Because we're looking at decarbonising heat, a lot of the focus there's been not always, there's been a lot of heat electrification. So you need to think of all of those things together rather than as a singular aspect. So looking at renewable generation, electricity grid constraints, so all of the package and what are the steps to get to a site from today and onwards to net zero, and trying to do that consistently. So looking at the way that government assesses things economically, so using a green book process to do techno-economic evaluation, and then just capturing the key part of the program is to capture that insight, so that learning can hopefully be taken forward to other sites. Next one, Carl. So there have been 42 sites within the program. I've been involved in the concept design element. So 24 of those sites we've developed the concept design plans for the site. 36 of the sites have had energy monitoring and sub-metering, which is the focus for today and what Carl is talking about. And 4 sites have looked into taking forward the concept design and delivering measures on site. and that's been looking at that from a technical and a sort of a commercial delivery perspective. So the next session is around the delivery aspect. So a lot of learning of working in different areas of government of how we can take things forward with different supply chains and arrangements, etc. So there were 15 prisons involved, 12 MOD sites, and 13 hospitals. Do you want to talk briefly about this one, Carl?
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of an overview of what we've achieved, which kind of gets repeated later on. But we've developed strategies for all 36 sites that we've worked with. We've deployed, brand new submetering systems in 23 of those 36 sites. That has totaled more than 800 submeters. So sometimes we've installed new ones, sometimes we've connected to existing metering or existing BMS systems to get those 800 submeters. And that data is all going to an online platform that can be viewed by ourselves at Energy Systems Caspot, but also by the people at the sites. This has mainly covered electricity, gas, heat, and some water meters. Typically, they're inline meters, clamp-on meters, and pulse converters where we've got existing meters that we just need to get the data from rather than replacing. And as I mentioned, we've sort of connected to BMS systems where they exist and where they're good enough to connect to.
Yeah, so before we go into the main focus of the presentation, this is trying just to summarize a key part of the program, and I suppose the challenge of getting to net zero is that we need to think about the whole energy system and at the site level, all of the different components on a site that use energy or have an energy system. So what we've learned in the program with that target of initially 50% non-traded emission reduction, but then on to net zero, is that we need, the key focus really is around decarbonising heat. So whilst we're still doing typical energy efficiency, low regret measures like LED lighting replacements and things that save energy and have a payback, they need to be thought about alongside changing the site's heating system and what the plan is to do that at the site and what the design would be. So you then need to think about the built-in fabric of the site and what changes need to be made. You need to think about is there a kind of renewable generation strategy and some of the aspects I've talked about already, such as if there is going to be projected electric vehicle demand at the site, and trying to think of all of those things together. Some of the key learnings have been a lot of the sites we've worked with, that might involve adaptation or change to the heating system distribution at the site, which can be quite complex dependent on the heat options. So it's trying to think about all of those things together. So for a site, you can put a plan, you can look at existing assets for a site and site plans, site development plans, site maintenance plans, and asset plans, and put a pathway and a timeline in place of going from today and what are the changes that you need to do to that site to get it onto net zero. And I suppose net zero has changed everything really, where we need to make sure we're doing works which align with the future plan for the site and that they all join up to get to that net zero journey, so we can do that cost effectively. So I think, so just from my own insight, and before we go into the things Carl is going to focus on, about why we need to monitor energy consumption. So trying to develop a concept design for sites. And Carl, I don't know if you're going to cover this, but when we've looked at existing metering BMS assets at site, there's been, in general, which is a generalization, generally a good level of electricity data and understanding and metering. But from a heat perspective, that's generally been quite poor. And when we're looking at how we design a new heat system for a site, and where we've got different heat demands for hot water, different, I suppose in a hospital, different parts of a hospital need heat at different temperatures for different uses, and just different parts of a site there hasn't generally been a good understanding of, other than a main gas meter, of how to use heat on site and what the sort of the temperature of the heat is delivered at. So a key aspect of getting your site to net zero is to really understand the energy use and site, and definitely heat alongside other uses. So the sort of metering solution is key, and that's something that Carl might talk about. But to just there are other benefits which we can, as well as developing the design for the site. So just to start with, Carl, as well as developing the concept design for a site and trying to work out how to get it to net zero, what are the sort of other reasons why we might need to measure energy consumption at a site?
Yeah, sure. So it's the old adage of you can't manage what you can't measure. Using energy costs money, and unless it's clean energy, it produces greenhouse gas emissions, which contribute towards climate change. We may know how much energy we're using at a site level because we have bills from suppliers, but we don't necessarily know, like you say, in which buildings or what times of the day, by who or what is using that energy. And cost-wise, energy, certainly in my experience, it was the second biggest cost at the organisation I worked for after staff wages. So it's quite a significant concern, and it's quite often something that's not really managed or measured at all. Some meter data allows us to identify where energy is being used, what times of the day, how much energy is being used, and we convert this data into emissions data and cost data so we can start to quantify what we're doing. And we can use this data then to identify wastage and inefficiencies. For example, energy used when the buildings are closed, or heating left on when it's warm outside. And having access to this sub-meter data can help us support some business cases. And like you say, which sort of supporting the concept designs and energy efficiency initiatives. And we can use this data before we apply for funding to provide evidence to support an application, or after an installation to show the effective initiative. Sorry, and that might then support sort of further rollout.
Okay, thanks, Carl. So we've identified that we know energy data is, I suppose, essential to understand site energy use, so you can think about the design for a site to get it to net zero. There's an opportunity to, a lot of the work that we've done in the MET program has been for the sites that have, some of the sites have gone on to make PSDS applications for funding to implement the solution, so the data's helpful there. But you've also mentioned, Carl, about you can use data to identify waste and save money at a site, which can help, I suppose, when you can kind of put that into an overall package, help with the cost of getting a site to net zero. So could you tell us more about how you can use that data to identify opportunities to save energy and money at the site?
Yeah, of course. So I mentioned that it helps us to identify energies that are used when a building is closed, and this is known as what we call the base load. It's typically energy that's used overnight or at the weekend, although obviously closed. It obviously depends on when the buildings are open and closed. There are a couple of examples here in the slide of the graph on the left. The columns on the left-hand side of that graph show data of energy data every 30 minutes. And those first third of the columns closest to the y-axis show the time between midnight and 8 a.m. So that's when the building is closed. And that might show sort of energy used by servers and alarm systems, CCTV, maybe some external lighting and security people that are working in the building and so on. But it's approximately 30 kilowatts, which is about 40% of the midday peak demand. So it's quite a lot of energy that's used when the building is mostly unoccupied. And the graph on the right shows energy use per day. So it's a total summation of the day's energy consumption. And the columns coloured red are the weekends. So again, this is when the building is closed. And the base load here is approximately 3.5 kilowatt hours per weekend day, which is just over half of the energy consumption that is used during the week when the buildings are occupied. Obviously, I'm not going to advocate that we shut down security systems and turn off servers and things like that, but the energy used here, per weekend seems to vary quite a bit. So, for example, if you have a look at the weekend that's highlighted by the green circle, it's a little bit lower than what it is at the weekend highlighted by the yellow circle. And we don't know what's causing this variation. and 7,000 kilowatt hours across a single weekend is about £1,000. And that sort of difference between the green weekend and the yellow weekend is sort of 150, £200, which may not sound like a lot of money taken in isolation, 150 to £200. But if you do that every single weekend, that's £10,000 across the course of a year. That's going directly to the energy company, straight out of operational budgets. And this is just one building, just weekends, just from looking at the data across a couple of weekends. There's potentially sort of £10,000 worth of savings that can be made just from looking at that data there. We can also use energy data to identify some trends. So using half-hourly data, we'd identify a daily profile. And again, if you look at this graph on the left-hand side, we see the profile of being sort of quite low consumption between midnight and 8 AM. And then people come into the building, start using the building, and we get to sort of midday and we have a sort of peak. Probably people making a cup of tea and microwaving their lunch and those kind of things back in the day when we used to go to the office. But then it gradually kind of declines over the course of the afternoon, and then has a sort of second peak around 6 PM, and then gradually declines again across the course of the evening to midnight. Now, the first thing I'm thinking is, why isn't that kind of having a sort of a more of a sharp shutdown when people are leaving? Why is that a sort of a gradual decline over the course of pretty much 12 hours with a sort of second peak at 6 PM? Equally, looking at the graph on the right, we can see that the daily total energy use seems to vary per day. Sometimes it gets more and more as the week goes on. Sometimes it gets less and less as the week goes on. So again, there's some things that might need to be looked at there. And finally, one of the things we're looking at to do in MEP is to develop some benchmarks to identify best practice across the sort of 36 sites that we've been working with. We've got several hospital wings, we've got several prison wings, we've got several office buildings, and we can look across these groups to identify instances of good and bad practice, and use this insight to inform some investigations. So we can, start to ask questions about why one hospital's wing is using more than another hospital's wing, if they share the same characteristics such as size or the number of beds or the age of the building.
Okay, so thanks, Carl. So just to sort of try and summarize so far, we've talked about having the energy data to develop the plan or the design for the site to decarbonize. Carl's just talked about using that data to identify opportunities to save energy and money at a site. But a key part of having that information as well is taking that design or plan for a site, or just at the project level forward to do a business case. So within MEP and the program, I know a lot of the sites we've worked with have had to respond to the government funding scheme called the PSDS scheme. And I don't know if we can have a show of hands for anybody on the call who's had to make an application to PSDS, which that would be good to know. So I can see one on the call, so that's good. So the PSDS was the government's grant scheme to take forward energy projects in non-domestic sites. The turnaround to make that application was very tight, and I know very challenging. And having spoken to a number of sites, it was kind of they were unable to do that because of a lack of information to put into the application. So a definite reason for having this energy data and understanding of the site is to support grant applications and business cases. So it would be good, Carl, if you could sort of expand on that.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Yeah, so the screenshot that's in there is from the public sector decarbonisation scheme PSDS application form, and that specifically asks for calculations of energy savings before the project is implemented, and monitoring of savings once the project is installed, and both of those things are possible if you have sub-metering data. And having that access to quantitative sub-metering data makes these calculations more robust. So I've been in these roles in the past, and you can make sort of a simple calculation to say, I'm going to replace this type of light bulb that uses this much energy, and replace it with this type of light bulb that uses this much energy, and you can make some assumptions about how much those lights might be on to work out how quickly you'll sort of pay back that investment in those light bulbs. but you do need to make assumptions. You do need to make some guesses about how many hours per day those lights are on, and therefore how quickly those light bulbs pay back. Whereas if you have actual sub-metering data, you can actually look into that and divide it by the number of lights you've got. If you've got sort of sub-metering that goes down to the level of individual circuits in a building, I've certainly worked in public sector sites that have got that level of detail. And then you can actually sort of work out actual figures and actual energy usage from which to base your calculations. And so those assumptions become a bit more robust and a bit more quantifiable and easy to validate and calibrate your calculations. But then used post-intervention, that's when I think sub-metering data becomes really powerful. You can sort of see the periods before your intervention alongside the periods post-intervention. And hopefully you can see that change where your energy has been at a high level and then perhaps drops. And you can do things called QSUM, where you can calculate the amount of energy and CO2 and money that you saved post-intervention. And that's really useful then when you go back to funders, either through PSTS or through internal funds that might be available. And you can show that your intervention has worked, and you can show that the savings have been made and how long that investment will take to pay back. And that then increases confidence and trust as you sort of seek further applications for further interventions. It's quite often a difficult ask to secure funding. Sometimes, proactively replacing equipment that may not be broken, that may just be working absolutely fine, but just quite inefficient. But if you can show through quantifiable evidence that the investment pays itself back within a short period of time, then you're more likely to receive that support.
There we go. Okay, thanks, Carl. So yeah, I suppose just to summarise the kind of the three main reasons that we've and reasons for having energy metering and taking the approach is to help develop that design for the sites, to help with business case applications or grant funding, but also to sort of more traditional energy management approaches for projects and identifying savings. So, but some of the things I suppose that I've been involved in 24 sites and working with Carl throughout the program is, I suppose, what does best practice look like, and how do we sort of develop a solution for a site? So how do you go from looking at a current site, Carl, to identifying what the kind of level of metering is needed on a site? Could you go through that, please?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So unfortunately, there isn't a sort of a single easy answer to identify what best practice looks like, because it kind of depends on several factors. Across the MEP programme, we've tried to monitor each energy supply to a building, so typically electricity and gas. But like you mentioned earlier on, Richard, as a sort of decarbonisation of heat is becoming more of a priority. So we've also put some clamp-on heat meters downstream from the gas boilers to understand the heat consumption. And also kind of separating also out the different heat circuits within a building. We've always tried to get half-hourly data. That's what I've typically worked with in the past. Other resolutions of data are available. You can get 15 minutes data or every minute or every second as well. But we didn't want to have too much data that would sort of cause the opposite of having too much. We also looked at specific equipment or facilities in buildings if we thought that they were large consumers of energy. So some of the sites had flight simulators, some had X-ray machines and CAT scans, CT scanners. Obviously, some of them had swimming pools as well. So we kind of focused on those kind of buildings. Some of the buildings we focused on specific areas. So, for example, laundry areas or kitchen areas, and sometimes specific circuits in the building if we thought that those circuits had things on them that were of interest, whether that be electricity or heating circuits. Quite often, some of the sites we worked with in MEP were very large, and so we had to decide what we were going to submit and what we were going to leave out. We had a limited time to complete the installations, and we had a limited budget as well. So we had to kind of take into account those considerations when we're determining not just as level of sub-metering per site, but then also that site's compared with other sites as well. I just wanted to sort of flag as well the kind of potential pitfalls of over monitoring. one of the buildings we had in MEP had 300 electrical submetering in a single building, and they were collecting meter readings every 30 minutes, which is nearly 15,000 readings per day for one single building. So it's kind of getting a balance between that level of monitoring, where you have so much data, you can have time to look at it to identify where things might be going wrong, to having the kind of greater level of detail than just having a single electricity and a single gas meter for our whole site.
Well, on that, Carl, Steve, I don't know if you can see it, there's a question in the chat which sort of could be related to the level of metering on the sites. Can you see that in the chat, Carl? So Stephen has said, can you share any tips on how to be confident over a base load for a building when it varies so much daily? So like in your second graph, so I think that's on the, that was probably on the slide before. So can this only be done with confidence once you have sub-metering data rather than whole site data, even at half hourly? So yeah, just having, I suppose at the scale of sites we've worked with, just having a half hourly, gas data, Stephen, for heat, when there's so much variety on the site, which is very difficult. So any comments?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, certainly. I think if you have sub-metering data per building, you've got a much better chance of identifying what the base load is. I'm just trying to think of some examples where, say, for example, in a hospital, if you just had the sub-metering data for the whole site, the hospital being open, the main building with the wards in being open all through the night would have a very high consumption, and this would be a very large part of the consumption for the whole site. And if you had some kind of satellite building that was only open sort of 9 till 5, Monday to Friday for outpatient appointments, for example, because that building was much smaller and only open for a short period of the day, that kind of base load for that building would be very much subsumed by the much larger main building with all the wards. And so trying to identify that kind of base load for that smaller building would be very difficult if it wasn't submetered separate to the main building. See your question, of course, Stephen?
Yeah, okay. I think just on that hospital point, Carl, so the thing is, so we were trying to look at, there are parts of a hospital that are 24-hour, 24/7 for operating theatres and areas that needed to be heated constantly versus parts of the hospital that didn't. So trying to differentiate those, looking at hot water use, there's steam use at a lot of hospitals. So understanding, steam heat versus hot water use versus different types of space heating, heat demands across the site. And it's, I suppose, yeah, just trying to, I'll probably talk about the process now of that, but trying to break down that site and get the balance right that Carl said. So we've definitely, and to do the design of a new heating system at a site, it's impossible, really. Well, not impossible, but a lot more beneficial if you do have that understanding of site and actual what the demands are across site, because depends on the new heat system, if that's decentralized, centralized, or part decentralized, to design the system without knowing what the heat loads are has been difficult. So it's been helpful for that as well. Thanks, Carl.
Sure, thanks, Rich. So in the next few slides, you can talk about the process that we've developed in MEP. And this takes us right from the very start, thinking at a high level about what we wanted to achieve in the programme, right to the very end when we get to the analysis of data from the meters that we've installed. We very much believe that this approach is robust and can be used across other programmes and across other sites and organisations that are looking to implement a sub-metering programme. The stage 0, the planning stage, occurred once, obviously, and then the stages 1 to 5 were repeated and implemented on a site-by-site basis. So the stage 0, the planning was right back at the beginning, probably a year ago or so. And we took a very high-level view of what we wanted to achieve across the sites we were working with, looking at the budget and the timescales that we had. And we looked very much at what existed in the market already in terms of sub-metering solutions, how those things were installed and what the advantages and disadvantages of each of those were, before working with CCS to establish a sort of procurement and delivery route, developing some tender documentation and using the Helga framework to appoint some subcontractors to work with us. And then obviously once we've got those subcontractors onto the program, we onboarded them and got them up to speed with everything we were trying to achieve. In terms of establishing the technology that required, we once we'd appointed the subcontractors, we didn't want to tie ourselves to a particular type of submeter or to a particular type of way of communicating the data to the platform, and instead wanted to be as open as possible. And that came with a challenge, because at the same time as wanting to be open, we had kind of security concerns. Obviously, working with the Ministry of Defence and the Ministry of Justice, security is quite important. So it's kind of weigh those things up. And we also knew that on each of the sites we work with, they already have existing systems in place, and we wanted to utilise those as best we could, because there's no point in installing new metering in places where there already is metering. And so if we use the existing metering and just connect to it, and being open is more likely to allow us to connect to existing systems, rather than being wedded to one system that was closed and that wouldn't integrate with existing systems. So the stage one on a sort of site-by-site basis would be what we call an initial assessment. You may have heard through some of the other bite-sized webinars about the discovery phase in MEP, and that would be whereby sort of high-level information about the site and its services and infrastructure would be gathered. We'd use this to familiarise ourselves with the sites, how many buildings are on the site, which ones are the big buildings, where equipment or facilities are located, what types of heating systems in place, and so on. And the first part of this initial assessment was to understand the existing metering arrangements. So we kind of know that all sites will have some level of fiscal metering, and sometimes it's just a single fiscal electricity meter and a fiscal gas meter. But sometimes there's more metering than that, depending on the sort of historic use of the sites. We'd also look to understand the existing sub-metering and BMS systems on sites, and whether or not they can be connected to. Quite often, especially with BMS systems, they were quite old, quite in various states of repair and disuse and use. But sometimes we did find that they're very good, and they're quite easy to connect to, and all we needed to do was just to connect an outbound data exports, and then we could connect to existing metering. And then where we sort of needed to complement existing systems or start from scratch, we'd finish the initial assessment by identifying where we'd like to install new metering and where that should be installed. And we'd certainly look to the size of the buildings, what the buildings were used for, how many people use the buildings, and use that to sort of help us to prioritise between the buildings on the site. We then discuss this initial assessment. We'd obviously do that ourselves at a desk, and we'd then discuss that with the site. And we'd quite often learn quite a lot during this review with the site. Quite often we'd find out about buildings that were sort of due for demolishing in the next few months or years. We'd perhaps find out that although a building looks very large from the plan view of the site, actually it's just used for storage and nobody actually uses it, so it's unheated or not of interest. But other times, certainly with the prisons where things are a bit more standard, our approach was very much spot on, and the feedback from the site was quite minimal. We had some other considerations during the initial assessment, and you may have heard about these through the bite-sized sessions, and certainly the sort of concept design workstream that Richard mentioned previously. So we've kind of tried to work with the concept design team to ensure that where we were installing sub-metering and where concept designs were focusing their efforts were the same buildings, so we could help to develop the evidence base before implementation of energy efficiency initiatives, but also once those are in place, we could also help with gathering that evidence and showing the effect of interventions. Although every site we focused on electricity as well as gas metering, as Richard mentioned earlier on, there was a greater emphasis on gas and in specific heat metering than it was electricity metering, and that graph there shows a kind of decarbonisation of the electricity in the grid and how it's sort of shortly becoming or due to become cleaner than gas, and therefore the driver in MEP was to sort of being to support the carbon emission reductions of 50% by 2032. We sort of naturally placed a greater emphasis on some of the gas and heat metering than on the electricity metering.
Carl, have you seen the chat comments? Because Stephen, did you ask this at the last session? I can't remember. Someone asked something similar at the previous session. I don't know if that was yourself.
Yeah, there's certainly a generic email address at the end, Stephen. So I think you can contact that. But if I don't know if you want to contact us through that, and then perhaps we can have a chat. I'm certainly happy to help you discuss how we've managed to sort of integrate all these solutions and getting data from existing systems. More than happy to help. So post stage one, we'd get to we'd sort of have that discussion with the site and sort of have an agreement on a sort of initial assessment and approach with the site. And we'd pass this then to the subcontractor to enable them to do a site survey. Due to COVID, everything's happened in the last 12 months. Due to COVID, this was sometimes the first time that anybody from MEP had actually been to the site. Not always, but sometimes that was the case. An installation subcontractor they'd go and have a look at the buildings that we'd identified, have a look at the equipment and the energy supplies in those buildings, and put together a quote for installing the sub-metering and connecting to the existing systems that we'd asked them to do. This would be very much a detailed site visit, sometimes carried out over the course of 2 to 3 days. And, some of the sites that we were working with had sort of 200 or 300 buildings, so it was quite a big ask for them to go and do that. And they would go to opening up distribution boards and electricity panels and assessing how to connect to those systems and chasing heating pipe ducting and those kind of things around a building. The quote that they'd give us would cover the hardware and installation costs and labour costs, but also they cover the kind of their assessment of installation complexity and kind of detail any kind of shutdowns that might be required to install the metering. And we'd review that quote with the contractor and review this additional information that they provided to us, and look at those issues and look at those with thinking about the budget and the timescales as well. And like I said, that would cover the kind of connecting to existing systems and existing metering, and also installing new metering where it didn't exist already. After this review, the review with site would then take place, and the exact process and installation would be discussed with the site. And this would go down to the level of exactly what hardware we'd be installing in exactly what places, how it works, how it communicates data, and how it gets that data into the online platform, and what kind of support we need from sites. And often that would kind of raise a few eyebrows. Sometimes the way to get the data out of the site was to use SIM cards, and obviously prisoners weren't so happy about having SIM cards. But also, Ministry of Defence were nervous about communication systems as well. So quite often having bespoke installations there, and bespoke sort of SIM cards that would only work in the machines that we were, and the metering solutions that we were installing. We'd also do things like CDM, the construction design and management roles would be agreed. We'd also develop what we call the proforma, to get some additional details from the site about the buildings where we're installing the meter, things like the exact size of the buildings, so we could work out the energy consumption per square meter. What times of the day that the buildings typically open from until, and how many people use the buildings, or what type of equipment was there. We obviously had some of that data from the discovery, but just to pick that up as well from the site. And at this stage, we'd sort of raise the POs for the installation.
I think because on the time perspective, we'll probably get near the end with the slides you've got left. Is there any questions from anybody? I know Stephen's posted one on the chat, but just take a quick second to see, if there's any questions from anybody, or what you've heard so far. We might have a chance towards the end, but it's probably a good time now just to check. If anyone has, just please raise their hand.
Hi, Suzanne.
Yeah.
Hi there, guys. It's just a very quick one. One of the problems that I have experienced with regards to overlaying various BMSs on top of BMSs, one of the things that I'm really, really keen on is working through a more consistent AI program, to drive much more intelligent use of the building. So, and I get absolutely everything you said, between buildings that are used 24/7, CCTV, security, and so on, so on, so on. And I'm just wondering, if you had the opportunity to overlay AI, and what was your experiences? Because I've got a little pilot going on at the minute, and obviously before I roll that out, I'm keen to get other industry sort of appreciation of that. Sorry if that takes everybody off track, and I'm happy to come back at the end if that's any good.
Okay, yeah. Steve has just raised his hand. I think Steve, I'm sure Steve, did you ask a similar question in a previous session, possibly?
No, I was asking more around.
Sorry.
Well, my question's totally unrelated. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. So we had a similar question. On the last session I was at, which was the same as what you've asked there about the AI solution.
Yeah, I don't think we've necessarily looked at more sort of joining up that artificial intelligence data that we can gather from other BMS sensors just yet. I think it might be something to do in future programs, and certainly we looked at things like IoT sensors to sort of pick up on actually what we're having set temperatures according to the BMS, but what does that mean in terms of the comfort of the occupants in the buildings? So we haven't done that yet, but happy to if you want to drop us a line, Suzanne, I'm happy to discuss how we might help you out.
I will do, because obviously one of the things that we've sort of experienced through COVID is that the natural warmth envelope that a building would have, where people, generally are circulating, and we have thousands of people in our buildings, rather than what we have at the minute, which is constrained numbers. So using AI over the top of that to try and sort of track a bit of that as well. But I was also fascinated if anybody else had any experience of overlaying AI in a very secure environment. And what I mean by that is, so if you've got Wi-Fi enabled AI, how did various elements get past the numerous security precautions that we all have to jump through? I was just really sort of looking for other people's experience on that more than anything. Clearly, nobody wants to go there. That's absolutely cool with me. That's fine.
No,
it's certainly it was like I mentioned with kind of getting the data out from the sites and onto the online platform. There was certainly several hoops and things we had to jump through to get that. And I sort of mentioned the sort of machine-to-machine SIM cards that we had, and although we could tell people that they'd only work in the machines and they wouldn't work in a mobile phone, there's still obviously quite a lot of nervousness taking them into prisons and MOD sites, quite rightfully so. So we've certainly faced some of those challenges, Suzanne.
Do you want to follow up, Suzanne? There's an email on the end. You could drop Carl a line, because there are some other colleagues who might have been thinking about that. So we could just to see if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm quite happy to do that, and sort of just it's more of a feel, because what I am a great believer in is not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but certainly using the best wheels that other people have, because I certainly find with regards to SR bids or Silex bids or anything like that, anyone that had a sort of an inside track on how best to achieve, it was a really, really useful exercise for me, because then I wasn't completely working in the dark, and I was actually bringing together meaningful data from other sites that I could then, use to influence our sort of direction of travel on our ISO 14001.
Yeah. Okay. Steve, just another minute then on questions. So.
Yeah, it was just basically about what good looks like, and a repository for case studies of where things have really been successful. Is there a plan for central management of case studies?
There is a plan for sharing a lot of what we've done in MEP. I'm not sure whether it will allow you to sort of have case studies necessarily, just because of the sort of security of the sites. having access, sort of having plan views of the buildings and where we've installed some metering and that kind of stuff. I'm not sure. I don't want to promise that we can have those kind of case studies.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that coming from the MOD. We're very precious about our data in that format anyway. But clearly, where there can be generic examples provisioned, whether it's the latest gadget or whatever it might be, it would make sense that rather than regurgitate and restudy anything over and over again, that we would have that location of that well-known myth versus fact sort of scenario.
We've got a time. Chris is thinking about the dissemination of the program. So have you got anything to?
Yeah, so all I would say, Steve, is that what we want to do is we want to be able to communicate the approach that we've taken, to think about, what drove us to have that sort of guidance about where we picked to monitor and what we wanted to do, so that it gives you the tools to be able to then pick it up. And we can write within that, and I should think that we will, situations where things have gone well for us and bad for us, but we can write case studies as well, but the level of detail that we'll be able to put into it means that sometimes it won't be as useful as actually, following the approach that we've suggested, because we can't talk about specific sites or specific buildings unless we get it cleared. We've been through an exercise of working with yourselves and all of the partners that we've got to make sure that we are able to share what we can, but there's a degree of anonymization, which means that quite a lot of it will be not specific.
No, I understand that. I think if we can make it so we protect the individuals or the site names or the specifics, but keep the basic premise of doing a action that attained a certain outcome would be kind of useful. I think certain technologies.
Yeah, as an example, maybe alongside the guidance, but we'll take that on board, Steve. So thanks, Steve. So Carl, just for your time, we've got 5 minutes left, and
indeed, I'm conscious that.
Sorry, I've interrupted you by asking questions, but yeah, do you want to just try and do a minute wrap up per slide, and then I think then we'll be on time.
Yeah, sure. So stage 3 was to develop and agree the program of works. So once we'd had the sign off from the site, we'd kind of put this detailed program of works in place, and that would cover exactly what meters were installed where, on what day, at exactly what time. So 9 to 11 a.m. we can install such and such electricity meter. And therefore, we'd kind of be able to plan things like shutdowns. And quite often on some of the sites, those shutdowns would need to be planned in sort of maybe up to 4 weeks in advance. Certainly on some of the sites where there's sensitive equipment being used, and certainly on the hospitals, for example, shutdowns full stop, which is not allowed. So that's where we kind of plan all those kind of things. We'd also quite often need the sites provided with escorts to chaperone our installers around. And these are some of the challenges that we faced when we sort of developed and agreeing these program of works. And some of these weren't necessarily uniformly applied. So if we went to one prison and that had a category level B, for example, we'd have some level of enhanced security clearance that we need before we went there. We went to another prison that was equally the same level of security level, and then they wouldn't necessarily have those same requirements on us to sort of have security clearance beforehand. So sometimes it made it a little bit difficult to predict what we might face on a site-by-site basis. Some things were fairly uniform, things like RAMS documents, asbestos registers, and details of the installers and their qualifications. And one of the things we did as well, just to sort of check before we got to the site, was always to have sort of checking meetings, and we'd have those a week before we were due on site, and then also 2 days before we were on site, just to kind of just make sure that everything was in place and all the paperwork and everything was signed up, and everybody was kind of fully aware of exactly what was going to happen. And then stage 4 was the installation, and quite often, certainly for us at MEP, this was a kind of the easiest stage. This is where the subcontractors went to the site, spanners and screwdrivers, and actually went out and actually went and installed the sub-metering and connected to existing systems. Obviously, these things don't always go go smoothly. So quite often things took longer than we anticipated, and snagging or return visits were required, and that would then require us to go back to stage 3 and develop new programs of works. But once everything was finished, we'd have a kind of commissioning sheets that would be passed to us, and the site and the platforms that hosted the data, and that'd have all the details of the sub-metering that was installed, and how it exports the data, how it identifies itself through sort of sub-meters, and those kind of things. And then we'd have the training sessions with the sites to sort of talk them through how to access the platform, how to log in, how to look at the data from their sites, and how to do some analysis and the kind of things things to spot things like identifying base loads and identifying wastage and those kind of things. So stage 5 is the data analysis stage, where this is the next stage of the program for us. We're just starting to get a lot of the data onto the platform and just starting to use it. And we're just starting to make those initial impressions. We're very much looking at the benchmarking I mentioned before, to sort of work out, what does a good prison look like? What does a good prison wing look like? What does a bad one look like? What does a good hospital wing look like? What does a good MOD office building look like? But then also to mention to identify the wastage, identify where things are, heating systems that are still used in July because they haven't been switched off yet, or energy that's used over weekends and evenings when buildings are closed, for example.
Do you want to wrap up, Carl? We're 1 minute left now, so I don't know. Is there one slide now just to kind of that would be best to wrap up on? Maybe challenges, maybe.
Yeah, so the challenges are kind of sort of mentioned throughout. So time and budget is obviously going to be a challenge. We've managed to install sub-metering in 23 of the 36 sites we sort of developed solutions for, and the 13 that we didn't, they've actually come back to some of them actually gone back to the subcontractor and said, look, can we do this still through a separate route? COVID obviously a spanner in the works, and if it wasn't kind of COVID or Brexit, then sometimes the metering was stuck on a boat in the Panama Canal. So there's quite a few challenges that we faced, but just to sort of touch on the achievements, there's 36 strategies that we've developed, and 23 sites have had those, and like I mentioned earlier on, there's 800 sub-meters installed, and we've got sort of access to more than 50 gigawatts worth of energy at any one time.
I think, Carl, we're on time now. So
just to make that email address onto the slide. So the next steps are to share a lot of what we've discussed today. A lot of it will be available on the government portal in the coming 6 months. If there are things, if there are people who want to get in contact, I know Suzanne and Steve, if you want to get in contact, drop us a line, and more than happy to discuss things by email or have a Teams chat and help you out. So any questions at all? I know we've sort of run out of time.